Hey guys, this is John, and I'm playing JoLeaDondo in a 5+5 game on chess.com. It's another climbing the rating ladder game. My opponent opens with knight f3. I'm going to play my customary d5. And let's see if white plays a fianchetto. They do. I like to build a pawn wall against this fianchetto on g2. I think this is a good way to play. Just have that bishop staring against the d5, c6, and b7 pawns straight off the bat. So let's play knight f6. Usually white castles and stays flexible. Now you can put the bishop on either f5 or g4. I do think it makes sense to liberate the piece immediately before playing e6. One thing we want to focus on as we're rising up through the rating levels is coordination, having our pieces work in harmony. And a bishop outside the chain is working harmoniously with your pawn structure. We don't want that bishop sitting on c8, unnecessarily blocked by the e6 pawn. I like to put my bishop on e7 in this setup because if white ever threatens e4, attacking the bishop, it'll be nice if they can't play e5, forking a bishop on d6 and the knight on f6. So just one little tip I've picked up in this line. Okay, c3. I think I'm just going to castle. I'm not sure if white has plans to pop the queen out to b3 or maybe play queen c2, trying to uphold an e4 break. Okay, so white's going to hunt down my bishop. I do want to move this bishop because allowing white to unnecessarily play knight takes f5 and double my pawns doesn't seem smart. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play bishop g4 so that if white wants to track that bishop down, it comes with a price. So if h3, I can play bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, and I will argue that white has weakened their king side to some degree by pushing the h and the g pawns. That might bode poorly for their king safety. Also, if g4 is played here, I could even play, for instance, knight f to d7, trying to open up an attack on the knight on h4. I may do that if I'm feeling feisty. We'll see. My opponent taking their time in the opening. I think they also have some connection issues too. In my experience, your opponents will continue to play fast all the way up through the higher rating stratospheres, even if they have time. So that's not a comment on this opponent's time usage, but if you follow, for instance, my standard playlist, which are the most serious games I play regularly on my channel, time and time again, I'm talking about how my opponents just never really seem to adjust for the time control. They just play at a certain pace. They basically play at blitz speed, even when afforded longer time. So I think my opponent here is doing a good job of managing their clock. Queen e1, this move looks odd, but white is getting out of the way so that they can prepare e4. If they had played it on the last move, their queen would be hanging. So how do I want to anticipate that? Maybe I can play knight bd7. So if e4, I'm thinking knight c5, attacking the pawn here. Knight bd7 is a nice move to complete my development. So I'm gonna go with it. And let's see if white follows through with e4. I'm not completely sold on knight c5. White could play queen e3 then and defend the pawn. But I feel like this is a no-nonsense move I can play with little thought, so let's do it. They're leaving open the option of playing g4 and trying to hunt down the bishop. I could still play bishop g6 in that case, or maybe even knight e8. King h2. Not sure why white would play that move. So I'm completely developed. There's no immediate threats to worry about. So I can start playing on my own terms and maybe expand with my pawns. This is a position it's closed. It's hard to land any direct blows or even organize an immediate tactic. So one thing I would think about doing is either further improving my pieces or gaining space with my pawns. So I'm looking at moves like a5, advancing on the queen side, poking around over there. I could maybe play a move like queen c7, just getting my queen on the same diagonal as white's king. That's interesting, in fact, because that hinders g4, and maybe in the future, if this bishop is pointed at the knight, white could experience problems with the g-pawn being pinned. So perhaps if e4 right now, I can play knight takes e4, and however white recaptures, bishop takes h4 is coming. Okay, white goes for f4. Intriguing. Okay, so this signals their intention to block this diagonal and maybe play for a future g4, f5, trying to trap my bishop. Okay, so I'd like to disturb this knight if I could. Maybe knight e8, trying to attack it, coming to d6. Maybe h6, although then g4 could be played. I think I might go with knight e8, although g4, the queen is defending the knight on h4, cleverly enough. If I leave the position as is, g4, bishop takes g4, h takes g4, knight takes g4, is kind of cool, followed by knight e3. I wonder if I could try to bait that out of white. That would be interesting. Okay, I'm going to play h6. I want to see if white bites on g4. And I might go bishop takes g4 and sacrifice the piece for 2 pawns, but jump my knight into e3, attack the rook, and also gain the ability to play knight c2, forking the queen and the rook. White could play their knight somewhere. I think knight f3, knight d to f3, that is, makes sense in this position. He goes for e4, okay. So if I take, pawn takes, maybe knight c5. Yeah, let's open the position up a bit to begin. I'm not completely sure about h6, because if ever I play bishop g6, I won't be able to take with my h-pawn if white captures. So I'm committed to taking with my f-pawn, which could leave the e6 pawn weak. But I am relying on some short-term tactics to confuse the issue right now. Already a noticeable difference in quality in this opponent compared to the opponents I've played previously, these last few videos in the Climbing the Rating Ladder series. Okay, so he takes with the knight. This one allows me to take on e4 and then take on h4 if I like, which I think I will do, because I can wreck white's pawn structure on the king side. I do have to surrender my dark square bishop to achieve this, but given that g4 is hanging over my head otherwise, it'll be very nice to give white double isolated h-pawns. I'll have a compact structure. I can play off of that. Yeah, so let's play bishop takes h4 and just wreck those pawns. This light square bishop is now pretty safe on h5 after white recaptures. It's monitoring the d1 square. So I'm thinking, in preparation for play down this d file, maybe rook a d8. Could also play knight c5, but I like rook a d8. I feel it's more subtle. Not committing the knight yet, but just lining up on the file. When trying to outplay an opponent, it's often good to give your opponents many choices. So kind of give them ambiguous options. If you constantly play forcing moves and your opponent only has 1 or 2 possible replies, then you're almost compelling them to play accurately because they just can't do anything else. So I know when I play low-rated opponents, this is a strategy I use all the time. I try to give them a chance to go wrong. Okay, queen g3. So that leaves e2 weak, but can I exploit that? Not that I can tell. I have to be aware of some threats against my king. If the f-pawn moves, bishop takes h6. Moves like that. For now, I think knight to c5 is looking nice. Trying to use that d3 square that I just mentioned. Yeah, maybe I can even bring my rook into that square. Let's do it. So bishop e3, rook d3. Maybe I can make waste time getting out of the pin. Although queen f2, and they'll be attacking the knight twice and possibly the pawn behind it if I move the knight. So bishop e3, what other moves could I consider? Knight d3 is going to hit the b pawn. Maybe knight d3. Also bishop e2 after knight d3 is kind of tempting. White could always shift this rook over to g1, couldn't they? And try to line up some threats. Okay, f5. This one I wasn't as worried about. I feel like white's play was based on activity, and here they're allowing me to trade queens and maybe lock up the position then. Play a move like e5. Also, what if I play a check on d3? Because if e5, bishop e3, then white gets to close it down. Even though white has the 2 bishops, I feel like I should not close down the position now. Yeah, maybe rook d3 check is a better idea now. Yeah, let's do that. See what we can gain from this immediate check. White will play king h2 or king f2. I would think king f2 is a bit more appealing in order to support bishop e3, because now if I play e5, how does this bishop get out? That's a question mark for white. Yeah, let's do that. And I like this piece being restricted. Maybe rook g1, looking for bishop f1, trying to boot my rook from d3. He must have heard me. Okay, now I feel like I should play a prophylactic move, maybe king h7, so that if bishop f1 is played, bishop takes h6 is not coming. That would be a nasty surprise if I were to overlook that. So king here. Tough opponent. He's playing well. Or she is playing well. But if bishop f1, rook d1, white is pinned. They can't move that bishop. They can move the bishop from f1 to try to induce a trade, but e4 is loose. So that's going to create problems for them. I just get the sense that white misplayed their potential attack. Just checking rook d1, making sure that works tactically. I think it does. Yeah, now knight takes e4 as a threat. Because I feel like when white played this plan involving f4, having brought the queen to e1 to defend the knight on h4, they were looking to attack, and with f5 they offered to go into an ending, or a queenless middle game rather, where I don't seem to have much to fear. So b4, this drops the e4 pawn as far as I can tell. Knight takes e4. Just watching out for any tricks involving like rook takes g7, bishop takes h6, that sort of thing. I don't think they ever work though, so let's go ahead and take that guy. Maybe white needed to play bishop g2 there to defend the pawn on e4. Time is becoming a factor now. We are playing with a 5-second increment. Okay, so here, rook d2 check. They do have rook g2 in reply. So maybe capturing and then rook d1 is better. Or alternatively, just doubling up right now. Maybe doubling is a simple way to play this. Let's do that. This bishop is buried on b2. This looks good. Not much coordination going on in white's position. I would probably move the light square bishop if I were white, just to have the rooks communicating with each other. Plays f6. Okay, so this introduces bishop d3 check options, but beyond that, not really seeing how this is going to work. Okay, so I could look at rook d2 check. That would force white to play rook g2. Maybe I just take the pawn then. I was thinking rook d2 check, rook g2, bishop f3. It's a bit to calculate. You know what I'm going to do? I'm simply going to take with my knight, because time is a factor, and I know I'm up 2 pawns now without having to damage my structure even. Yeah, this move drops a bishop. I can take with... Actually, I could have taken with either rook. Okay, so a little practical moment there at the end. I'm not going to claim that knight takes f6 is objectively the best move. It's a fine move. Secures me another pawn. It's quite possible there's something better, but with the amount of time I had, less than a minute remaining, I could spin my wheels trying to calculate something like rook d2 check, rook g2, bishop f3 to see if I'm winning material, trying to force white to take on d2 so I can check and deliver a fork on the king and the dark square bishop. But if time is of the essence, you have to be practical with your moves, and knight takes f6 was a practical move. So I'm just going to tell him thanks for the game. And yeah, my opponent played well. I think he displayed some nice ideas in the opening. And let's go analyze this one. So white played knight f3. I do think setups for white with knight f3 or c4 on move 1, so the English, or just bringing out the king's knight, I think higher rated players, that is players maybe 1800 plus, can probably benefit more from those openings than players who are a bit lower than that, because to play knight f3 or c4 successfully, you often have to have knowledge of d4 openings, so queen's pawn openings, because there are abundant transpositional possibilities. Those lines can just transpose in and out of each other. And I think if you have a good background in d4, you can successfully play knight f3 and c4. But I wouldn't recommend it for lower rating stratospheres because I think you need to build up that experience. And I haven't met too many 1700s who have the necessary d4 experience to play knight f3 and c4 successfully. So a bit of a tangent there about openings, but if you are tempted to open knight f3, c4, just know that they're fine openings, but maybe best left for a bit later in your chess development. So since I play d4, d5 as black, whenever I meet knight f3, I almost always play d5. I mean, I also dabble with some other stuff. Like if you're a Sicilian player, you can play c5, because if white plays e4, you've transposed back into that opening. But d5 is my go-to against d4, d5. And if white were to play d4 here, we'd transpose and I wouldn't have any issues. So g3, c6. As I mentioned, I like having these pawns on the same diagonal as white's bishop. Two connected pawns on the same diagonal as a bishop are going to restrict that bishop. And three connected pawns, as you see here, even better. So it's no wonder that this is one of the most popular setups combating knight f3, g3, bishop g2. So white castles, I played bishop f5. And interestingly, this ends up looking like a London system reversed. So if you're familiar with the London system as white, then you probably wouldn't mind playing this line for black because the principles are very much the same. Get the bishop outside the chain. And I mentioned harmony. It's not necessary to play a move like e6. If you play e6 here, I mean, the computer might not say it's a huge mistake or anything, but in my eyes it is, because why lock in this bishop? Be aware of what your bishop is doing in relation to your pawns, because bishops and pawns often clash early in the game, unlike knights, which can navigate pawns much more easily because they can jump over them. But bishops can often have roadblocks created for them unnecessarily. So no harm, no foul in playing bishop to f5 and then pawn to e6 thereafter. I'm not worried about the slight lag in my kingside development. White is castled and I am not, but the position is closed. White has developed in a calm way. They're not signaling they're going to try to attack me and suddenly rip open the position and get at my king. So leaving my dark square bishop back for the moment is fine. Knight bd2, bishop e7. I mentioned that I like putting the bishop on e7 in this line because if you do play bishop d6, you just have to be aware of some issues involving e4, e5. So let's say hypothetically white plays this queen e1 idea again. If black were to castle, oops, e4 comes with tempo on the bishop. And after something like this, let's say, then e5 is going to fork these two pieces. So bishop e7 is a cautionary move designed to address that problem before it becomes a full-blown loss of material. So bishop e7, white played c3. I'm not sure I like this move. I don't see how this move fits in with white's setup. More often, white is going for the e4 break. Sometimes they play for c4. But c3, on the other hand, I don't see what white gains from this because advancing on the queen side doesn't seem that threatening to black. I could always undermine such a pawn with a5. Unless white was planning on bringing the queen out right away, which isn't really in the spirit of the position anyways. An attack with a major piece is not going to be effective here when there's no open lines. So yeah, I don't like c3 very much. If I wanted to, I could play h6 right now, so that in the event of knight h4, I can always drop the bishop back to h7. But I decided to castle knight h4, and no reason to allow white to play knight takes f5 and double up my pawns. So bishop g4, trying to ensure that if white does want to chase this bishop, they're going to have to weaken their king in the process. I don't think bishop g6 directly is that bad of a move, but it is accommodating. White can take, and you've given up the bishop pair without a fight. So bishop g4, more dynamic. h3. Yeah, now queen e1. I do like these moves that white played. Aside from c3, I can't disagree with their approach whatsoever. And now I complete my queenside development. I bring the knight to d7. In the past, I've sometimes played c5 followed by knight c6. So staking out some more territory on this wing and trying to develop the knight to arguably a slightly better square than d7. But I played it closer to the vest this time around and just developed the knight to its conventional square. And king h2 was another move that seemed a little out of place to me. And especially given the fact that I put my queen on c7 and white had some issues on that b8, h2 diagonal, I think this move is questionable. If white was going to proceed with the plan of trying to swamp my bishop over here, maybe f4 directly, trying to go for g4. Or, as I thought white was doing, maybe e4. I think one of these two pawn pushes is probably white's best bet. So king h2, I just connected the rooks. So I'm doing well in the development category. But now after f4, I did have to readjust my thought process because this move took me by surprise, and it's not a bad idea for white at all. I've seen many games in this type of setup where an inattentive player playing black just gets mobbed by these pawns. Because if my queen was not here, I mean, g4, f5 is going to create some issues for this bishop. g4 will force it back to g6. f5 is going to attack it. The bishop may not immediately get trapped, but it's on the verge of it. So when you encounter an unexpected move, especially one that changes the pawn structure, that is a quintessential critical moment, a pawn structure change. You have to spend a bit more time than you're used to and try to adjust your thought process accordingly. Because pawn moves often signal big changes in the position. Even though this doesn't clash with my pawns yet, I would still consider it a pawn structure change because that f-pawn's not moving backwards and it does contain the g4, f5 plan. So h6, I'm not completely sure about this move. This was a semi-waiting move, trying to see if white would play g4, so I was playing a bit of hope chess here. And my intention, if white continued with g4, was to sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns, and then let's say white played king h1. I can't just win the knight because it is defended by the queen, but I was going to come in here, trying to gain a tempo on the rook, and if this rook were to move, let's say rook g1, then go here and fork the queen in the rook. And this line looked kind of fun, and I decided to go with it. But that said, this might be one of my weaker moves in the game. I don't think I can overreact to f4. There's no move I see that's going to punish that move per se. But I bet if I spent longer here, I could come up with something good. Maybe even a flexible move like rook a d8. As you saw later, the rook was good on the d file when the position opened up. Maybe that could be played. I mean, if white wants to go g4 here, yeah, again, they're going to run into bishop takes g4, so they might have to move their king back or something in preparation for this. And you could make a strong argument that rook a d8 is a more purposeful and useful move than h6. So, going back to that moment, after h6, white played e4. Not sure about this one. I think white should correct the error they made with king h2 and tuck the king on h1. g1 is not that safe because of this weak diagonal. White has moved the f-pawn and weakened that diagonal, but h1 seems like the proper square. It's a move you could play and just be confident that it sets you up for later. You could play some other move, of course, too, like maybe moving the knight, trying to get the bishop out, but I feel like in almost every line, white should hide the king from the same diagonal as that queen. So I wouldn't mind playing king h1 here. That's a hard thing to do in chess, though. White just played king h2 like 2 moves ago, move 11. This is move 12. So playing king h1 would feel like an admission of failure. But if you approach the position objectively and decide you have to do it, that shouldn't bother you too much. So e4, pawn takes, knight takes. And when I saw this, I was happy because after this trade, I get to take on h4. And now I never had to worry about my bishop on h5 becoming trapped. So maybe after I took on e4, white should recapture with the pawn. This looks like a more challenging move. White does dominate the center now with these 2 pawns. I probably would have continued with, for instance, knight c5 and try to poke and prod and maybe threaten knight d3. If queen e3, perhaps rook over here. Again, this square becomes weak for white. But I think that would be a more consistent approach. So after knight takes e4 and this trade, and I take here, rook d8, leaving a bit of mystery about my intentions. I mentioned I can consider knight c5, but that so obviously goes for the d3 square. I was afraid if knight c5, white would play queen e3, attack my knight, and cover that square. So therefore I played this, maintained the flexibility of the knight. So queen g3, and now knight c5. And here is where I think things started to go astray for white. despite potential inaccuracies by my opponent and very likely an inaccuracy or two by me, I think white has a completely playable game here. I would play bishop e3. It's move 18. I think it's high time to get this bishop into the game. So bishop e3 connecting the rooks looks like the way to go. And I know I can use the d3 square in this case, but connecting the rooks, creating harmony between them is going to solve a lot of issues for white. And it would keep me on my toes too. I mean, this rook g1 idea is a move that I only realized later white could try, looking to move the bishop and create an attack against g7. And given that white is attacking my knight right now, I've got some issues to sort out with that piece right away. So this would be interesting. I mean, rook d3 can make an argument for that. Knight d3, I also thought briefly about knight a4 here, trying to get at the b2 pawn. But definitely I think bishop e3 should be played by white. Instead, they charged ahead with f5, and internally I'm breathing a sigh of relief when I get to trade the queens, because I feel now with my better coordination and superior pawn structure, the long-term advantages are pointing in my favor, and even some of the short-term ones, like that superior development. And if white can't attack my king, what can white really claim that they have an edge on me here? It doesn't look like white can point to anything. So I played rook d3 check, and then played e5, and I'm purely playing to restrict this bishop. That's what e5 was designed to do. Take away the f4 square. Now all of these squares are taken away. White's got big problems. I think black is clearly better here. Maybe they could play a disruptive move like f6, but that doesn't help white's development issues. I'd probably just ignore that pawn for now. If f6, maybe just rook over. F takes g7, king takes g7. So white played rook g1. And you should always be asking yourself, what did my opponent's previous move do? And in this case, I would be a fool not to realize that rook g1 intends to move the bishop. There's no other reason to put a rook immediately behind a piece. You're probably going to be moving that piece. The only other reason you do it is to defend it. But white is looking to move that bishop and combine with their dark square bishop to assault these pawns. So if I were to play, let's say I play like this now, rook fd8, I'm walking straight into the punch. Bishop f1. I guess I maybe can play this move and try to pin the bishop. I didn't consider this option. But let's just say hypothetically the rook goes somewhere else, just to illustrate this. Take, and this would be a nasty surprise, having the pin on the g7 pawn. So, in fact, in view of that line, maybe I can play rook d1 here and everything's okay, but I felt like king h7 was a fine way to address the threat before it became an issue. So just stepping out of the way. There's no rush for black here. I do have white restricted, so let's just let white squirm a little bit. Again, giving our opponent chances to go wrong. So bishop f1, I played here. Bishop's pinned, so even though we're no longer guarding the e3 square, bringing the bishop out would lose the rook, lose an exchange. Yeah, and here, white lost the thread, and I won the e4 pawn. So it appears that in this position, white has to play bishop back to g2 to defend the pawn. But I think there's at least one or two ways I can keep the pressure on. Doubling up the rooks looks simplest. Although here, white can play bishop e3, and suddenly the rooks are protecting each other. Maybe it's not as easy as it seems. I mean, optically, it looks like black should have something right now. But what would that be? Maybe I start with the capture, and then I'd love to figure out a way to attack this pawn, but getting the bishop somewhere here takes too much time. Maybe something like knight here, so that if the bishop does move, I can take here. But that also introduces some questions like, can white, I don't know, play bishop takes a7 or rook b1? Rook b1, I guess I have knight c4 attacking the bishop. Maybe some line like this. I still feel black is better here, superior structure. White's got a lot of weaknesses. But this is a fight, nonetheless. But I think putting your opponent under sustained pressure like this, even if it's pressure of the positional variety, and giving them chances to go wrong, most of your opponents are going to crack at some point. And my opponent finally played a bad move, b4, allowing knight takes e4. But if bishop g2 had been played, it's still up in the air what the result of the game will be. So, nice game by JoLeaDondo. They put up a very good game here. Just some moves that I think they could have improved on. I think c3 in the opening. Again, that move never seemed to fit with White's setup. Most everything White did from this point forward was on the king side anyways. So c3 was inconsistent. I think this plan of going f4 was interesting. I don't know that the king being on h2 is the best way to prosecute that plan. I do think White should maybe play king h1 at some stage and just admit that the king does not belong on h2. I suggested taking with the pawn instead of the knight. That would prevent this trade followed by bishop takes h4, wrecking White's structure. If I were to single out any one move, though, that hurt White, it was probably the trade of queens. Now, I think f5 gives Black what they want here. I would be much more afraid if White keeps pieces on the board and tries to coordinate, like bishop e3. Whereas f5 allowed me to transition to an endgame. I've got the better pawn structure. My development is great here. And in a couple moves, I was able to shut down White's play. So now it's kind of one-way traffic in Black's favor. Okay, so next I will play a game against a player in the 1800 to 2000 rating range. So stay tuned for that video. And I hope you guys are enjoying this instructional series where I climb the rating ladder and try to play players of all different types of ratings. Anyways, leave me any feedback in the comments if you had it, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.